down to lower Manhattan. What is that going to be used for?
That's going to be used to move debris out of the way so that the emergency vehicles can get in and out quickly, so that we can get the ambulances in in a more expeditious fashion than we've been able to do. And I want to thank the Deputy Mayor Rudy Washington, who has spent most of the day coordinating, getting all of that emergency equipment in the right place, ready to move. If you go along Houston Street, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of pieces of equipment that are lined up to move in and to take debris out. And now they've started doing that. And I think that's probably what you observed.
From ABC 7 News, this is a special report. Continuing coverage, America Under Attack.
Good evening. I'm Maureen Bunyan with Kathleen Matthews at ABC 7, bringing you up to date on the impact of these terrible attacks today at the Pentagon and at the World Trade Center on life in the Washington area.
That's right. As you've heard up in New York, here in Washington as well, there's been a real attempt tonight on the part of public officials to assure Americans that even on this darkest of days that Americans' freedoms will remain intact. Ground zero, of course, in Washington is the Pentagon, and that's where ABC 7 News reporter Kevin Schultz is now tonight. Kevin, bring us up to date on the situation there.
Well, Kathleen, we are outside of the Pentagon. All the rescue crews, of course, are still on the scene. We were one of the only TV crews allowed on the grounds of the Pentagon this evening. In fact, our tapes had to be reviewed by the FBI before we could show them to you this evening. We joined the Montgomery County Urban Search and Rescue Team from Rockville. That's the same team that went to the Oklahoma City bombing and rescued people in that disaster. We rode from their headquarters in Rockville in a bus and set up fort about 75 yards from the hole in the Pentagon that we have been looking at all day. There are about 30 to 40 members in this team with 3 search dogs. They go into the Pentagon for 3 hours at a time. When they come out, they tell us that they see concrete upon concrete, electrical wires everywhere, desks teetering on the edge of floors that have been blown away, and of course bodies of people who did not survive the tragedy. We did see the FBI agents bringing out bags upon bags of evidence. We saw a designated area for plane parts. There was not a piece larger than 2 feet. The Montgomery County Rescue Team has set up a fort in what has become a tent city on the grounds of the Pentagon. They plan to be here 10 days straight. They are joined by rescue teams from Fairfax County, Nashville, Tennessee, and Virginia Beach. We will have a close-up look for you of this rescue team and their efforts from today when we join you again tonight on ABC 7 News at 11. Reporting live from the Pentagon, I'm Kevin Schultz, ABC 7 News. Back to you.
Kevin, we look forward to your report.
Also, of course, these incidents have affected traffic all over the Washington area, and we want to bring you up to date on that. We should tell you that Park Police have reopened the remaining streets around the mall. Also open are the bridges between the District and Virginia, and Interstate 395 in both directions are open, but there are some closures around the Pentagon, including Washington Boulevard. In the District, some streets are still closed around the White House. The monuments and the memorials are all still closed. Kathleen?
Well, as of this evening, there are some additional schools that have decided to close for tomorrow. We want to bring you the very latest there. First of all, D.C. public and all charter schools are going to be closed. In Maryland, Anne Arundel County, Montgomery County, and Prince George's County schools will close. Here's some of the new ones. Alexandria City schools will be closed tomorrow, as well as Arlington County schools. Fairfax County schools will be closed, as well as Falls Church schools.
Many offices will be open. We are told the Pentagon expects all of its personnel to be at work tomorrow. Also, all federal offices and all district offices will be open, and personnel is expected to show up to work at the Pentagon, federal offices, and at all D.C. government offices.
We leaped ahead a little bit there, and you saw some additional schools in Virginia. I hope you had a chance to check those out. We'll be back in just a half hour with the very latest on all of this. Meanwhile, we rejoin ABC News in progress.
Her brother was still trapped under 40 feet of rubble near the Forward Hotel in Manhattan. John, help me. The Forward Hotel is the Marriott Hotel, which used to be the Vista Hotel. It's all the same hotel, right?
It's now the Millennium Hotel,
okay.
But it's the hotel that stands directly in front of the World Trade Center on West Street.
All right. And she called to say that he gave specific directions to her where he was located and said he was there with 2 New York City policemen, because policemen and firemen are under this rubble as well, because they were going one way when everybody else was fleeing in the other way. We don't know who her name is and his name is, and it doesn't matter. But it is why on an occasion like this, there's always hope. And if you think about a building collapsing on itself, we've seen this before in earthquakes, and we are always astounded, no matter where it is in the world, now how primitive the conditions, that people survive for days and days and days on end. So the imperativeness of getting, this place quiet, which would be very hard in the next few hours, so that people can work in there with some measure of efficiency. The importance of getting in the dogs. They're sometimes called mortuary teams, which is grisly, but they're called that anyway. The federal government has sent 3 of them to New York and a couple to the Pentagon as well. But the value of dogs and the value of searching as quickly as you can through the rubble almost invariably turns up success stories, no matter where incidents like these occur. We've been joined by Barbara Walters, who I think is as appalled as all of us by this. What have you been doing? And what do you bring us?
Of course, we are all appalled. There aren't adjectives enough to describe how we feel.
Sure.
I just talked a few moments ago to Senator Orrin Hatch, who had some information. He said, remember the Millennium Threat, which of course you remember, Peter, we all do, and he said it was a very real threat, but if they had the intelligence to be able to block terrorist attacks. He said a month ago there was a general report that a big attack was being planned and that they pulled a ship out of the Persian Gulf. And he said they now have some data that says that people on the aircraft, these are his words, appeared to be associated with bin Laden. And furthermore, he has information that people generally associated with bin Laden, because he says it's more than one organization, acknowledge with joy that a couple of the other targets were hit. He said, Peter, that the next 12 to 24 hours are absolutely crucial, because if you don't find out who did this, within 24 hours, they all go underground. And he considers this an act of war.
Well, just before you go on, because I know you have some other news as well, if Senator Hatch is anywhere near a television set and can hear us, we'd like him to come on and explain this in some detail, because I think there's some skepticism around this. These remarks by Senator Hatch have been around by some time, and now they've been repeated by him to you, that there's somehow an Osama bin Laden collection very quickly. And I know people are desperate to find out what, but we certainly would like the Senator to come on and explain in detail what he means, and the connection to this ship that was being pulled out of the Persian Gulf some time ago. Do you know precisely what he's referring to?
He said, you may remember that the ship was pulled out because we thought that, I guess, that their feeling was, I shouldn't guess, that there may have been some attack on that ship.
Yeah,
so they pulled that ship out.
Tremendous sensitivity in the Persian Gulf ever since the attack on the USS Cole, in which 17, do I recall correctly, John, 17 Americans.
Senator Hatch also says that part of the problem and part of the reason that we haven't known as much as we should have is that the CIA has been cut so much and their budget has been cut so much, and we have not had the human intelligence to be able to infiltrate the various organizations that we used to have prior to the 70s.
Let me just ask you one more question. But
Yeah.
Senator Hatch appears to be talking about communication between people who either know or associated with Osama bin Laden in the wake of this incident.
Yes.
And we all know what happened in this incident. So is he talking about people talking about the operation in ways that you and I and millions of Americans would not?
Well, I guess what he's saying is we have, before they were saying, well, we think it's bin Laden, we're not sure, and he is saying, I have some data, I have some information that says people associated with him acknowledge that it's happened. So more and more the finger points more definitely at bin Laden. But I also talked to Senator John Edwards, Peter, who's a Democrat from North Carolina and is on the Intelligence Committee and is one of the, as you know, young, fresh faces that some people say might be a presidential candidate. And he didn't seem as definite. He had just talked to the head of the CIA, and we have that if you want to see
Okay,
that.
yeah, here's the tape. By all means, we'd like to hear your part of your interview.
Senator Edwards, I understand that earlier today you spoke to the head of the CIA, George Tenet. Can you tell us anything about that discussion?
The thing that's clear to me is that they're making real progress, that we're going to identify who's responsible for this, and that we're, in fact, as a nation, going to hold them responsible.
We keep hearing that it's Osama bin Laden. How do we know that?
I can't answer that question. I'm sorry.
Maybe this sounds like a very dumb question, but are we sure that this was done by foreigners?
Well, I think at this moment, the public is certainly not sure. I think the director of our intelligence gathering activities feel like they've made real progress and have a pretty good idea of what's happening and who's responsible.
Could I just have a yes or no? Are we sure it's not foreigners?
I can't answer that question. I'm sorry.
Senator Edwards, you've had concern now for quite a while about terrorist attacks and had wanted more security. What should have been done?
Well, actually, Barbara, there are some of us who've been working on some legislation, a law, that's directed at doing specifically that. Senator Graham, Bob Graham, Dianne Feinstein, and I, along with others, have drafted legislation before this incident occurred that does three things. One, puts more resources, more money into fighting terrorism, counterterrorism. Two, coordinates all of the federal agencies, and I think there are 41 of them that are involved, who are involved in counterterrorism, and creates a terrorism czar to oversee that effort. And third, gives the director of the CIA more legal authority to do what needs to be done to fight terrorism. I might add, Barbara, I think that the people who've committed these acts on the United States, who killed all those innocent men and women and children today, underestimate the American people. And I think what they're about to find out is the American people are strong, they are courageous, and they are resolute. And our response will be powerful.
Is this war?
Oh, I think whenever we see the kind of attack we saw in the United States today, certainly if it were state-sponsored, it would be war, and I think we should treat it as an act of war.
How do we combat this kind of terrorism?
We need more money spent on combating terrorism, which is such a serious threat to the American people. We need to coordinate to make sure that all of our agencies are working together in a coordinated fashion to fight these folks. And number three, we need to make sure that the legal authority is in place so that the director of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, can do what's necessary to fight these people.
Well, I must say he says some things which confuse me, and maybe in subsequent conversation with you got him. He said, if this is state-sponsored terrorism, it is war. And then he said it's war. So is he telling us something he knows about who sponsored this terrorist act?
What I thought was interesting, too, is when I said, are you sure that this is a foreign act? You know, could it be domestic? And he said, I can't answer that question. And that's why I said, well, you know, a simple yes or no. I mean, are we sure that this is a foreign organization? So I found that, and I kept pressing it and couldn't get further. I found that, you know, confusing myself.
Well, really
if it's state-sponsored, it is, but if it's an individual, it isn't.
Well, that's a technical issue, of course, as we've said earlier, because if it is state-sponsored terrorism, the United States is obliged under a declaration of war to do certain things. But John, let me just talk to John Miller here for a second, because John spends so much time on this. First of all, you have a senator say to us now, we're making real progress, but I can't say what it is. Now, I would argue at a moment like this that if we're making real progress, someone has an obligation to come and tell the American people they're making real progress and help them understand something.
And that may be true, and that someone might be the president. I think the box that the senator finds himself in, and of course you can't tell from his coded answer, is when he says, I can't answer that question, is it because I don't know, or is it because he's the recipient of a classified briefing that he could answer that question if he were allowed to?
I think my feeling was that he was the recipient of some information and just didn't feel that he should give it out now.
And if you were pressing him on that issue, would have caused him to breach that classified briefing by giving the specific answer or how he knew he'd actually be in violation of law and his clearance. That may be the stumbling block he found in those two very sensitive and direct questions.
The dilemma is that politicians want to be on television commenting on a situation, but they don't want to go as far as I think probably the public, not just us, would like them to go at the moment. He does say three other things, which I think are quite important at the moment, is that he is one of those people who's argued for more resources for the counterintelligence effort in the war against terrorism, and there are lots of politicians of both parties like him. John, he's interested in having greater coordination between federal agencies. There's almost invariably a lack of coordination on issues like this between the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, other elements even of the Justice Department. How bad is it, or is it okay?
It's bad. It's always been worse. The CIA used to be focused on foreign issues, the FBI largely on domestic. Since the FBI has become the lead agency in acts of international terrorism not on U.S. soil, they've had to compare a lot more notes with the CIA. You find that the FBI and the CIA now have a working desk, a terrorism desk together at CIA headquarters staffed by FBI people. CIA people are assigned to the FBI's Joint Terrorist Task Force. So you see them pulling closer together. But anytime you have the Defense Intelligence Agency the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the National Security Agency. You're going to have agencies that are competitive about who gets information, who distributes information to whom, and really who gets credit for information. And breaking down the bureaucratic walls between those divides and letting that information flow freely has always been a difficulty. Sharing.
Can I just ask you one question? What do you think of the idea of a terrorist czar? That is, somebody now who's going to be overall in charge of all of this, which was his other suggestion.
Well, I mean, in a case like we were just talking about, the sharing of information, the coordination of effort, that person would be, for lack of a better term, the grown-up that would divide up these agencies and say, no, this is what your role is going to be, this is what you're going to do, and stop competing or dividing efforts or duplicating.
Not my job.
Thank you, Peter.
Not my job. Thank you, Barbara, very much for talking to them. And as I say, if you're talking to Senator Hatch, tell him we'd like to talk to him, because there are several other questions we would like to ask him, given what he told you and also what he's got out there floating around on the wire services as well. I want to, just before we go to our next report, and as we look at Lower Manhattan, I just want to remind you of some basic things. There is, in the distance, late this evening, is the skeleton of the front entrance, of one of the World Trade Towers on the west side of New York, and that is what's left. And we had that young man go down today, and 110 stories up. You see that photograph on the right? 110 stories up on the right would have been the top of the trade tower, the single trade tower, and that, go back to the nighttime shot if we would, that is what is left this evening of the twin trade towers on the west side of lower New York City. 50,000 people worked in there. One of the hardest things to grasp all day is it happened just before 9 o'clock. How many people were at work? How many people managed to get out? How many people survived? First, the attack on the building. At 9:03 a.m. when the first attack occurred, and the second, sorry, at 9:03, just before 9 o'clock, the first attack, then the second one at 9:03, and then when these buildings collapsed at 10:28 approximately in the morning. And that is the number one question, I think, for everybody in the country, even paramount at the moment, to trying to find out who the perpetrators of this terrorism were. But it is part of our job to throw the net around the rest of the world and talk to our assets about why we might suspect one individual or another, and criticize, if we will, the fact that bin Laden's name, Osama bin Laden, Saudi citizen, Saudi millionaire, who has helped to finance a lot of operations in the world in the view of the United States. It's inevitable at a moment like this that his name comes up to the top. ABC's John Cooley, who's covered the Middle East and intelligence matters in the Middle East at every single level for us for almost 30 years, points out a short while ago in a message to us that maybe bin Laden is one of the obvious perpetrators here, but it's Cooley's judgment at this point, but acting on his own. John, may I just confirm for you, Osama bin Laden is a loner. He does not act in concert with government, or we've not seen any evidence of that, I believe, even though the Taliban in Afghanistan have given him some measure of protection. Fair comment?
Fair comment. The only indication we've seen of that is that bin Laden's people, according to U.S. intelligence, have cross-trained with Hezbollah, which, of course, had a very tight relationship with the Iranian government, but not with Iraq, not with Libya.
Okay. Let's hold this thought, because, in fact, Senator Hatch has called us from Washington. Senator Hatch, do you hear me?
Yeah, you called me.
Well, I'm very glad to say that we did.
Okay.
And whoever called who, you're being quoted pretty widely at the moment as inferring, and you're a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, or the senior Republican on the Judiciary Committee, rather. You're being interpreted fairly widely as believing, in the wake of this attack today, that you know some connection between it and Osama bin Laden. True or not?
Well, let me put it this way. I'm, as a ranking member on the Judiciary Committee, and as a twice member on the Intelligence Committee,
right. I
chatted with the top law enforcement people, the top people at the CIA, and they made it very clear that to me that just about everything points in the direction of Osama bin Laden. There's no question that they intercepted information that included people associated with Osama bin Laden who acknowledged that a couple of targets were hit.
Everybody in the world knew a couple of targets were hit, Senator.
Well,
did you press the question?
This is look, Peter. Don't give me that. These are people at the top of the CIA, and I'm just saying that that's what they said. And keep in mind, bin Laden said it was every Muslim's duty to kill Americans. We know that people associated with bin Laden are taking pleasure in this attack. We know there's some data on people on the aircraft who appear to be associated with bin Laden. They're still studying this, so they're not positive, but they appear to be associated with bin Laden. And, you know, we also are pretty darn sure that bin Laden was behind the attack on the USS Cole. So these are things that are very, very serious. Almost everything points to them, and it's a serious situation.
Yeah, I don't mean, Senator, to underestimate the potential of Mr. bin Laden. We're just trying to get at what you know today.
Well, that's what I know today. Now,
well, Senator, forgive me.
Sure.
The Associated Press also said, quote, attributes to you the information that law enforcement has data possibly linking one person on one of the 4 ill-fated flights to be members of bin Laden's organization. Is that true, sir?
It was told to me that there is some data on people on the aircraft who appear to be associated with bin Laden. I don't know which aircraft. I didn't ask that question.
Okay. I appreciate...
But they did say that they're still studying this, and they're going to try and verify that and bring that down to reality. But these are all just matters that appear to be, to be pointing in the direction of Osama bin Laden.
Okay. I appreciate very much, Senator, getting you on the telephone this evening and you clarifying for that. Just to reconfirm before we lose you.
Sure.
You, as you told Barbara Walters and the Associated Press, you've been talking to U.S. intelligence, and they've told you they intercepted communications between bin Laden supporters discussing the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
But to give you the exact language, it was that they got information that included people associated with Osama bin Laden, where they acknowledged that a couple of targets were hit. They didn't name the targets, but you have to presume. And this is top intelligence information that they told me I could comment about.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator Hatch. Appreciate you taking the time.
You bet.
Glad we were able to find you.
Okay.
So the senator does confirm that what he said to the Associated Press and Barbara Walters is what he actually heard from senior officials in the CIA, which takes us back, of course, to Mr. bin Laden. And there has been no one in the history of international terrorism who's been more elusive, who has stymied the United States to any greater degree. And we were talking just a minute ago about ABC's John Cooley, who's covered intelligence on the ground throughout the Middle East, and he makes a couple of observations which are quite fascinating. They're all speculation. They're all speculation. We're all involved in speculation today about bin Laden. But John Cooley says the Taliban could in some way assist bin Laden, giving him access, this is very interesting, John, to former Afghan Air Force pilots who were trained during the Soviet era, when the United States was, of course, using Afghanistan as a bulwark against the Soviet Union to some extent. He points out that Jane's Defense Weekly, one of the most authoritative defense journals in the world, recently did a recent review of bin Laden's military capability globally, which they did conclude was impressive, well-organized, and very wealthy. And I think everybody knows that. Am I right, John?
That's true, and I have to point out a couple of interesting facts about bin Laden, underlining that I continue to join in speculation. Number one, we learned in the embassy bombing trial that bin Laden had hired pilots and obtained surplus military aircraft to transport his people around. So there is a history of having trained people, professional aircraft pilots, to fly big planes, in this case, the smaller versions of the C-130. We also know from the same case that bin Laden had recruited former Egyptian military people who actually, one of them, Sergeant Ali Mohammed, became a U.S. military advisor with U.S. Special Forces. So the idea that it would be far-fetched for him to have imported the type of expertise who could give people, and forgive the irony of this statement, a crash course in how to operate a large jet, is not as far-fetched as you might think.
Exactly. It's interesting that John Cooley should remind us, and I should remind people at home, that you're one of the only journalists in the world who's actually gone to see Osama bin Laden and interview him. Oh, we're talking 3 years ago now?
This would have been in May of 1998, and the statements he made that day really portended the future. He said, and I quote, "It will be a dark day for America. We will send their sons home in coffins and in boxes." And he underlined not just people in military uniform, but civilians too. They are all a target of this fatwa, unquote. It was the first time he underscored that this is no longer bin Laden against the forces of the U.S. government. This was bin Laden against the American people, civilians included. It was 6 weeks after he made that statement in July when he, according to U.S. officials, blew up the 2 East African embassies, thus carrying out the threat he made. Right. And he has threatened several times, including once recently, to launch more attacks. In his latest video, essentially claiming credit for the Cole attack, or at least cheering it on.
This was the attack that appeared on Middle East television, and I think occurred at the time of his daughter's or his son's wedding.
It's the one even after that where he released a kind of a training video showing himself shooting guns and showing U.S. leaders and targets and so on. So he has underlined the threat that it's a continuing one.
All right, just to make clear to people at home, we're persisting with the questioning on this issue of anybody we talk to in the Intelligence Committee or with access to it, so that the country does not rush to judgment, even though, as John Miller and Senator Hatch most recently and others, John Cooley, our correspondent in the Middle East, make clear that Osama bin Laden is certainly a logical person to put at the very head of the suspect list. ABC's Brian Ross gives us some sense of background on at least a measure of the training that Mr. bin Laden has been involved in.
Commercial airlines have been a part of many of the terrorist schemes tied to today's prime suspect, Osama bin Laden. According to federal court records filed by prosecutors in New York, terrorists working for bin Laden have often received training as pilots, some with U.S. pilots' licenses for large jets. In fact, some pilots say the turn the second plane seems to have made in hitting the World Trade Center today would be difficult for an amateur to carry out.
I think we have to start looking for people who were trained to fly these planes, people who knew what they were doing, because no pilot would ever fly in and destroy everybody.
As for bin Laden, after tracking him through his cell phone for several years, American intelligence officials reportedly lost track of him last year.
People at NSA told me that they had been able to eavesdrop on Osama bin Laden for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden it all went silent. They weren't able to track him anymore.
Federal prosecutors say bin Laden has a pattern of making good on his threats, and just 3 weeks ago, the Middle East Broadcasting Company reported the latest warning from bin Laden and his followers that the coming weeks would bear significant surprises during which American and Israeli interests worldwide would be targeted.
Men must send their sons to the battlefields and the fighting quarters so that they can be prepared militarily for the religion of Muhammad to triumph.
That was 3 weeks ago in the Afghan desert. Brian Ross, ABC News, New York.
Thank you, Brian Ross, for that. It's amazing. There's nowhere in the world, including John Miller's trip to Afghanistan 3.5 years ago to see Mr. bin Laden at the time. There's nowhere in the world which does not have video from it in this day and age, whether it's provided by bin Laden himself or whether on that rare and unusual occasion a Western reporter is able to get to him and sit down and question him about his intentions and his motives. To the Pentagon now, to ABC's John McCarthy. John, you have some information.
Peter,
Hang on, John.
Small signs.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, you hear me all right?
I do.
We're beginning to see the first small signs of the U.S. military positioning itself to perhaps do something in the days and weeks ahead. There was an aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, that had switched out with another aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf and was heading home. That aircraft carrier, we are now told from Pentagon sources, has been told to stop dead in the water, turn around, and head back for the Persian Gulf. That's number one. Number two, after the World Trade Center was hit and the Pentagon was hit, we now know that the Pentagon had large numbers of F-15s and F-16s on emergency alert. They moved into the airspace around New York and Washington and secured the airspace. That is the first time, to my knowledge, Peter, that that has ever happened. Finally, one issue, Peter, that was raised in the President's remarks earlier this evening that is critical to those of us that watch the Pentagon and understand what some of the code is behind the words. The President said, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who did this act and those who harbor them." That is a critical statement, because what it is telling us is that the rules of engagement that America is going to go after these folks under are going to be different than it has ever been before. The United States is not going to be bound by those tight issues of collateral damage. They are not going to worry nearly as much about the loss of innocent life as they have done before. It is a very important signal that the President has laid down tonight.
We discussed that particular statement earlier, John. Does that not depend to some extent on who, if anyone, has collaborated with a terrorist, that is to say, a state?
Of course it does. But what they are saying tonight, Peter, again, to use the example of Osama bin Laden, if this is an independent terrorist operation that he may have been involved in, the signal is that the United States is going to go after the Taliban, and that is the government of Afghanistan that is harboring Osama bin Laden. But as you may recall, in other conflicts, the United States has been very, very concerned about the issue of what they call collateral damage, and that is the loss of innocent civilian life because of military strikes that the United States might take in retaliation. That is not going to be a concern, apparently, in this case, if the United States launches some sort of military attack.
Well, yet to be answered, John, whether or not the United States would suddenly change its mind about collateral damage and civilians. It's always been an essential point of pride in the United States, even when it has caused collateral damage, that this is not something a nation does easily. Let me run through these nations that are at least, and if not an issue today, at least, are you still there, John?
Yep, I'm still with you.
These nations which come up in conversation at all times like this. Iraq. The United States has thinks it's detected Saddam Hussein's hand in terrorism in the past, but there's no evidence, is there, that Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden get along?
They appear to have parallel interests, Peter, but they have very, very different religious interests. Osama bin Laden does not believe in the things that Saddam Hussein does, and American officials know that they have had contacts and conversations, but the indications are that Iraq and Osama bin Laden have not been able to see eye to eye on doing anything cooperatively.
Okay, that's one. Iran. Now, Iran is very much, or principally at least, and John Cooley points this out tonight from the Middle East, is principally anti-Taliban in Afghanistan, and not likely wants to encourage either the United States Roth or Taliban factions which want to make trouble in Iran. Fair comment?
Absolutely. There has been major border disputes between the Taliban and Iran. They do not like each other. They have had casualties. They've grabbed hostages. They are not on friendly terms. And in fact, Iran has been supporting the one faction in Afghanistan that has been fighting the Taliban.
And just to keep going down the list here, with which we've been familiar down for the last couple of decades, Libya, Colonel Gaddafi, I think, is described by many people as a flake these days, and certainly in terms in search of power in Africa, or better relations in Africa, because he wants to make a stronger economic base for Libya, and has shown no signs of being involved in international terrorism in recent years. Am I correct on that?
Peter, Muammar Gaddafi is no longer seen as the kind of terrorist threat that he was before. He has lost a lot of the momentum in the drive that he was trying to do about 10 or 15 years ago. And you are absolutely correct. He wants economic legitimacy because he now sees that as the only way that his country is going to get out of the economic problems that it has had over the last decade.
And finally, two other countries which have been involved in violence. Pakistan, a very unsettled country in the world, recently been a coup, very close association with Afghanistan, at least through its security services. Cannot imagine that Pakistan would want to incur the wrath of the United States.
No, not incur the wrath, Peter, on the one hand, but Afghanistan and the Taliban are their neighbors. The Taliban and the fundamentalist Islamic movement is beginning to have an important impact on Pakistan, on certain sections of Pakistani society. So while Pakistan would never support something like this, most analysts would say they can't control it either.
In other words, Pakistan, and particularly its security services, which have been suspected of fomenting or at least cooperating with terrorism before and cooperating with drug dealing going back and forth, they're, in some respects, the loose cannon within an already unstable Pakistan.
Well, somewhat of a loose cannon, Peter. We have to be very careful that we are not accusing Pakistan of being involved in anything like this. On the other hand, the Pakistani intelligence service has supported some things that Osama bin Laden has done very covertly.
Okay, and finally, because its name is often mentioned in terms of sponsoring international terrorism, is Syria. And again, I think people we check in with today would be really surprised, if not horrified, to hear that Syria would want to incur the United States' anger to this degree.
Not considered a likely contender, but again, both Syria and Iran do play in the Israeli-Arab dispute, and the whole issue of the foment on the West Bank in Israel is something that those countries do play in, but there is no indication that that conflict is connected to what has happened today. No evidence at this moment.
Exactly, John, and thank you. You end on a particularly appropriate note, because we are simply talking at the moment in many respects, giving what I hope is legitimate background in terms of the countries which have been involved in the constant conflict involving the United States, and prior to that the United States and the Soviet Union for many years, Israel and the Palestinians, extremist Islam, not Islam by any means, extremist Islam or extremist Muslims who regard the United States as an enemy. And so that's the aim of continuing that conversation. We have no idea at the moment what the CIA or the National Security Agency or the White House actually believes at the moment in the wake of these astonishing attacks today on the trade towers and on the Pentagon outside Washington. And recall back to the reporting earlier today, one of those aircraft, Dan Harris, ABC's Dan Harris, who was out in Pennsylvania, reported that at one point the United Airlines aircraft that went down in Pennsylvania, in fact, at one point had asked for a change of flight plan for Washington. And the plane crashed shortly after that, so we have no idea what that means. And in terms of the rest of the world's concern about this, we've talked a little bit about the height of the trade towers today. The tallest building in the world currently is in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, which is the Malaysian capital. It has a name, the Petronas Towers, I think it's called. The Petronas Towers or something, two towers, much more futuristic looking than the trade towers here, but it was evacuated today in the wake of a threat to it, as were many public buildings, malls, entertainment centers, all across the United States and in many other places today. We've had a couple of visitors today, young photographers, who were closer, I think, to the aftermath of this scene in the World Trade Towers than a great many other people who tried to get there. And we asked Connie Chung to put together a piece on the photographers today who managed to get closer than most people to what was actually happening. Here's her report.
Around 8:45 this morning, when the pilot witnessed an airplane crash into the North Tower of the World Trade Center.
In a day filled with images we may never forget, this one stands out. The extraordinary footage of an American Airlines jet slicing through the number 2 tower of the World Trade Center. That image was captured by 40-year-old freelance cameraman Evan Fairbanks, who had been working 2 blocks away.
I suddenly saw a white flash from the left side of the frame, and it lasted long enough for me to be able to identify it as a jet.
When you saw that plane hitting the Trade Center tower, could you actually fathom what you were viewing?
Not at all. It was very surreal. I felt like I was in another dimension, and we weren't even on the same planet. I guess as the human stories start to emerge and we see more people and we hear more names, it'll become a lot more real to me. But right now, I feel like I'm still in the bubble of the day, and the whole experience is just kind of numbing.
Fairbanks has been a cameraman for 16 years, but today he wasn't operating on experience. It was instinct. And that's what drew him back for one last shot. That's when the tower began to collapse.
I was looking in the viewfinder, and I just saw this reverse mushroom cloud billowing down, and I realized my proximity, and immediately just turned and started running north.
But for Evan Fairbanks, this is the image that will haunt him and us for the rest of our lives.
The image of that plane just coming out of nowhere, coming into the frame, and disappearing into the south side of the tower, as if a floor had been hollowed out and it was a hangar that it was just landing in. We've seen these images in movies, and we know that it's all artificial, and Hollywood makes it. And it's hard to put together that it's real this time.
Well, and as it was real, as everybody now knows. It's interesting, in the Middle East, political leaders have asked people not to celebrate this attack on the United States. It's interesting that, even in nations which have historically had a long friendly association with the United States, including Egypt, there has been a tendency among some people who have been more profoundly politicized in the last several years to acknowledge this attack on the United States with pleasure. In Cairo, it's reported tonight that some students, taxi drivers, and shop owners actually crowded around television sets watching what was happening here and saying in Arabic, Mabruk, Mabruk, which actually means congratulations. But it's fair to say, knowing the region reasonably well, that there are a vast number of people in the Arab world who are deeply attached to the United States, a great number of people who have family living in the United States today. There are some towns on the West Bank in the Palestinian territories today, one of which comes to mind is Ramallah, this deeply troubled city in the Palestinian territory today, where more people from Ramallah historically live in the United States than do there as well. And I think that is why Governor Pataki and Mayor Giuliani, and certainly the political leaders in your town, living elsewhere in the country, have made a special effort today to call on people to be tolerant and understanding, and not to lay blame and let their prejudice run away with themselves, because we don't know who did this. We do not know who did this, and any tendency we may have to lean in the direction of saying that one group or the other did it quickly reminds us of what happened at Oklahoma City, when we all thought it was one thing, and it turned out to be someone else. John McWethy is outside the Pentagon. John, I gather now you have what we can call a preliminary casualty figure.
It is a preliminary estimate, Peter. It comes from one of the fire chiefs who has been handling the operation here today. The Arlington County Fire Chief is saying there could be 800 dead in the Pentagon.
Can I just ask, John, could be or are?
Could be. They do not have a body count because they still do not know even how many people are really missing at this point. He made an estimate by figuring out how many people were in the area that collapsed, plus the people that were in the airplane, and that is how he came up with a figure of about 800.
Okay, thanks, John. And anything on injured at all?
None whatsoever, Peter, although they've been going out to the hospitals in Northern Virginia as needed, several hundred, we believe.
John, as horrendous a situation it was at the Pentagon, the military is actually in a better position to assess its casualties than anybody around the trade towers. Just simply it's got better records, know who comes to work in the place, and can check people more carefully.
Well, they have a whole plan for evacuating the Pentagon. In fact, I talked to one office that was supposed to be meeting on the helipad outside the Pentagon in case there was a problem. Of course, that's where the plane went in, so they had to assemble somewhere else. They are very organized, and the medical teams came in very rapidly, military and civilian, to this building. So they had a plan, they executed the plan. No one dreamed that they would ever have to do it because of this kind of attack, but they did it very effectively today.
Thank you, John. John McWethy at the Pentagon telling us that according to the fire chief, the Arlington fire chief, there could be there could be as many as 800 people dead in the attack on the Pentagon today. And lest you lose sight of it at all, this is where an American Airlines flight, American Flight 77, which was destined from Washington Dulles originally to the West Coast, had 58 passengers and 6 crew on board. This was the aircraft, this Boeing 757, which attacked the Pentagon today. I can't think of any other words to use other than attacked. And the fear of violence continues tonight. ABC's John Miller, I gather, has just heard of an incident in New Jersey.
The New York City Police Department has a report that the FBI is responding to New Jersey because a truck reportedly loaded with explosives has been stopped by authorities on the road there, and the men with that truck have been detained. Members of the Joint Terrorist Task Force, according to the New York police officials, are responding to question those people. I want to underline that all the phones to police headquarters and to the FBI from here seem to be disabled. So sorting through these reports to get specifics, to sort them out, can sometimes take time. But this is information that is in the possession of the police department, comes from the FBI, and we don't know the exact significance of it.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Well, I guess it's also clear to people now that ABC News is going to stay on the air for an indefinite period of time. For a variety of reasons, of course. One is to continue reporting the news, which is our job, and secondly, because of something that an American historian once said to me many years ago, that the television set is roughly equivalent to a campfire in the days as the wagon trains were making their way westward, and there was a catastrophe on the trail, and so people pulled the wagons around and sat down and discussed what went on and tried to understand it, and then went on the next day. And we do that in front of our television sets now in large measure today. We did it, you'll recall, at the time of the Challenger. We did it when President Kennedy was assassinated. We've done it in any number of incidents, whether we're working on television or watching television or contributing to it in some way. This is, in some respects, the national campfire, to use that analogy. And one of the things we try to do at the moment is to reach out and, not in any scientific way, try to understand how people are feeling about this. Not just the man-on-the-street interviews, which we'll get to in just a second. They're so important, but in terms of trying to understand what people's attitudes are about things. And so we did a poll. An ABC News poll has already been conducted, one of them. And you may find it interesting. One of the questions asked, did the United States do all it could, reasonably could, excuse me, to prevent these attacks? And there's a split right down the middle. 43% say yes, and 44% say no. Here's something very interesting. We asked people whether or not they had confidence in the United States to find and punish those who were responsible. And we asked people whether they were very confident or somewhat confident, and quite an astonishing 91% said yes, and only 9% said they had little or no confidence. Were people willing to give up some liberties? It's been a point of discussion throughout the day. Were people willing to give up some liberties to support a crackdown on terrorism? 66% in this poll, very quick poll. It's a limited number of people, only 600 people interviewed, plus or minus 4%, all those usual admonitions about it. But 66% of people said they would support sacrificing some of their liberties in order to crack down on international terrorism, on terrorism in general, and 24% said no. Would you support military action against groups or actions responsible? 94% said yes, and 3% said no. Would you support military reprisals even if it could mean war? And maybe this is not a surprise in the intensity of these early hours. 86% said yes, and 7% said no. Fair to point out that none of us have any understanding of what a definition of war is at the moment. The last time the United States went to war was in the Persian Gulf, and it was by conventional war standards, it was fairly casualty free for the United States, and we didn't even do as much, the United States didn't do as much damage to the Iraqis as they had originally anticipated. Concerned about future terrorist attacks here? Back to the poll very briefly, 2 more questions, Andy. concerned about future terrorist attacks here? 87% of the people we asked said yes. Seems like a sensible answer given what's happened today, and 12% said no. And worried? And this is where we've talked extensively today, or not extensively, but occasionally, about the effect on the national psychology. Are you worried, or someone, you or someone close to you, may be victimized? And 47% said yes, and 52% said no. So that's what we find in an early poll from our polling institute today, asking those very obvious questions in the wake of these attacks in New York and outside Washington today. Those voices from the street are very, very important. Here's Charlie Gibson with a report on them.
All emergency workers around the city are on call. There is mayhem and chaos, people running everywhere. A clear late summer day turns into what feels like a nuclear winter. People are caught in the tower, hanging out of windows, some jumping 80 floors to their deaths. Others hoping, praying to be rescued. As men and women head down, trying to flee the building, firefighters are racing up to do their job, only to become the first victims.
We better get out of the way!
Then, incredibly, Tower 1 comes tumbling, cascading down. Some of the emergency workers who managed to make it out need to be treated themselves. Fire union officials say of the first 400 firefighters on the scene, 200 are missing, probably killed. Meanwhile, there are reports at the White House that the Pentagon has been hit. A spokesman for the Pentagon said he had no firm number of casualties as firefighters struggled to contain the blaze. At 10:30 Eastern Time, the second World Trade Center tower collapses. And minutes later, a full-scale state of emergency is declared in New York.
The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible.
Police officers do everything they can to evacuate downtown Manhattan. The scene quickly turns to triage. Initial reports say at least 2,100 people have been injured, 600 of them taken to hospitals by mid-afternoon, 5 dead on arrival. 1,500 more walking wounded were taken across New York Harbor to New Jersey's Liberty State Park, and dozens of ambulances raced there as well. Meanwhile, uptown, hundreds turned out to give blood, some waiting 2 or 3 hours at blood donation centers. And then late afternoon, 5 p.m., still another building collapses. 7 World Trade Center, ruined by falling debris from the Twin Towers. But overall, there are some stories of lives saved.
As we came downstairs, we were just dragging people along with us.
At the Pentagon, workers continued through the early evening to contain the fire and smoke, but can't get to ground zero, where officials fear many are dead, including the passengers and crew from the American Airlines plane. One of those known passengers was Barbara Olson, the wife of the Solicitor General of the United States, Ted Olson. At this hour, where the World Trade Center once stood, casualties are expected to be overall in the thousands.
Mrs. Olson, who is widely known to viewers of cable and to network television around the country, is the only, to the best of my knowledge, the only person who we have publicly identified today who has been killed. And that, of course, is because, as Charlie Gibson has pointed out before, Mrs. Olson was in contact with her husband, the Solicitor General of the United States, while she was on a plane that had been taken over by terrorists. But as we heard from Mayor Giuliani earlier, and we heard from Governor Pataki, in part because, excuse me just one second, okay, in part because New York State and New York City have offices in the trade towers, and because Mayor Giuliani simply knows so many people in New York City, they know that friends and associates have been killed, and people in many, many parts of the country, without any doubt, know people who have worked in the trade towers or had offices in trade towers, and it is those people sitting on the edges of their seats tonight, perhaps desperately trying to get through to those government hotlines which we put up on several occasions, that we will put up again as the evening ensues, desperately trying to seek information. And we don't have any in a personal way yet. The hospitals in Lower Manhattan have been to some extent overwhelmed. You see these scenes on the street as well as we do, And so you can appreciate just how enormously difficult it is at the moment to get to the point of identifying people on the ground. It has been easier and desperately sad for people who knew other people traveling on the 4 aircraft that were involved in these incidents today, because there are passenger manifestos. And we know that the airlines have, over the years, improved tremendously their capacity to get in touch with relatives. Do you remember after TWA 800 there was something of a scandal? TWA was under tremendous pressure because the families of those people involved literally went out to Kennedy Airport and stood around desperately demanding information about their friends and relatives who were on that flight. And the airlines have become much better. So people, and 266 people, we believe, were killed on those 4 aircraft today. 266 passengers and crew flying on those flights, which were taken over by terrorists and then directed at these essential American targets today. Now, it's just a little before 8 o'clock in the western part of the United States today, and in a short while from now in the eastern part of the United States, some of the local television stations, our affiliates up and down the country, will be breaking away. We'll come back in a minute, but I want to check in with Cynthia McFadden, who's been down at the Chelsea Piers, right on the river, on the Hudson River, on the west side of Manhattan. And Cynthia, you have been waiting expectantly all day, because this was the place, or this still is the place, where people are expected to be brought.
This still is officially placed, Peter, the place where people will be brought. However, we've just been told unofficially, but it appears truly, that doctors are going to be dispatched to Ground Zero. At this point, victims are trapped in the rubble, and they're sending a team of doctors to perform amputations at the site. And the reason this place is empty, filled with doctors and nurses, but not with victims, is because the victims can't get here. So they're sending a team of doctors to the site.
Cynthia, has anybody shown up there today at all? There's been this long line of ambulances behind you.
Indeed, there have been victims brought here, but most of them not severely injured. They are still expecting a massive influx of victims, Peter. And this site still stands ready with 50 operating rooms inside. But at this point, they are going to dispatch teams to perform amputations on the site.
Okay, Cynthia, thanks very much. 50 operating opportunities at Chelsea. This is this enormous sports entertainment center on the west side of Manhattan, which has been turned into a disaster preparation area at the moment, and the federal government and the state government and the city and hospitals and volunteers from every aspect of the medical community have descended on these locations tonight to be ready, lest they are able to help. Governor Pataki and the mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, said a short while ago they've got enough volunteers at the moment, but the reason that the governor called for doctors, I'm going to dig through my notes here and see if I can find that number again. The reason that the governor of New York said that they were put up a couple of phone numbers was because he made it very clear that while they have enough doctors at the moment, even though the tremendous pressure on the hospitals in lower New York particularly, and burn victims have been taken to a variety of centers in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and as far north as Canada, not very far north when you think about it, to be treated. There is going to be a need for the people to be relieved, and so the governor offered this number for doctors who wish to volunteer their services. 518 is for doctors. 518-431-7600, 7600. And he also gave us another number for nurses. Shortage of nurses, as everybody knows, and he gave a number for nurses who wish to volunteer as 1-800-628-0193. 1-800-628-0193. This is not to imply a shortage of doctors or nurses at the moment. As Cynthia McFadden says, there are 50 operating theaters. 50 operating theaters set up in this huge sports complex, as close as you can reasonably get to the World Trade Centers, very close indeed, on the West Side Highway that goes down the west side of Manhattan, who are there prepared to help. That is that skeleton of the front facade of the lower part of one of the trade centers. And we've seen this many times, this horrendous result of the power of the collapse of at least one of the trade towers in and of itself, when the intense fire started when these two large commercial aircraft went into these planes, caused such fire, aided by aviation fuel, so that the steel simply couldn't stand it, melted, collapsed on itself, and then simply collapsed floor by floor down to the bottom. So we will pause for a few seconds while some stations on the eastern part of the United States go to local